Childe Harold's Pilgrimage is a very different kind of poem from anything we've read thus far. It's both a very personal poem and a long narrative poem, which I've only asked you to read a few stanzas of. Perhaps more than any of the other poets we've studied, it's hard to resist the temptation to talk about Byron's private life. And certainly the introduction given to him in your textbook tends to dwell on some of the more salacious details of his life, his many affairs with both women and men, his decadent behavior, and so on. And if all this sounds very familiar to us, it should. This was really the birth of celebrity culture that surrounds us today. Byron was perhaps the first literary celebrity in the modern sense of that word. People didn't just want to read his books, they wanted to know about him. His adoring female fans wrote him letters asking for locks of hair or to read their poetry. These are the kinds of things you can be assured that Wordsworth never had to put up with. And of course, his behavior didn't disappoint. He left scandal behind him wherever he went. And part of this might have been hereditary. His father was a notorious libertine. His great uncle, from whom he inherited the title of Lord Byron, brought that title into disrepute by killing a friend in a drunken duel and was known as the Wicked Lord. And his grandfather was an admiral known as Foul-Weather Jack. Moreover, Byron had a stormy love-hate relationship with his mother, who had a fierce temper herself. In his fragment, The Deformed Transformed, Byron's hero is chastised by his mother and mocked for his deformity to the point that he decides to attempt suicide, which probably gives you some sense of his feelings about his mother. So perhaps Byron felt that his predilection for scandalous behavior was inevitable based on his family history. He certainly started young, accruing heavy debts at school and making enemies of his schoolmasters. And at the age of 21, he left England to take a tour of Europe, starting in Spain and Portugal and ending up in Greece, Albania, and what is now Turkey, places that few Europeans went to at that time. And his poetic record of this journey can be found in the first two cantos of Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which he published upon his return to a rather unexpected success. As Byron himself observed, I awoke one morning and found myself famous. And part of the reason for this fame is the persona that he created for himself, the guise of Childe Harold, which rather thinly covered his own history. Child is an archaic term given to the first son and heir to a title before he has succeeded to it. So Harold is, like Byron, a young nobleman. And moreover, Byron gives a number of details about Harold's past that could equally well apply to himself. Essentially, Harold is a dissolute young nobleman who, satiated with his decadent lifestyle, has gone to see the world. This then is the first version of what has come to be called the Byronic hero, a guilty and debauched young man who is already tired of life. He has an obsession with pain and suffering that comes from an excess of pleasure. He is a brooding, bitter man with a guilty past, self-tormenting usually about some unspecified crime. He is contemptuous of social norms. He does not feel part of society and therefore does not feel bound by the laws of society. And the roots of this character are in the Gothic novel, where the Gothic villain is completely heedless of all law and human decency. In Canto 1, Byron says of Harold that with pleasure drugged he almost longed for woe. In other words, suffering starts to have an attraction simply because it's something different. It's a break from the norm. The fame that Childe Harold brought to Byron didn't really change his life all that much, since he was already pretty much corrupted. Fame didn't corrupt him, but it did make him the focus of more public scrutiny. He went on to marry Annabella Milbank, a woman he did not love and who clearly believed that she could reform him. Scholars are not quite sure why he did this. One suggestion is that it was an attempt to suppress his passion for his half-sister Augusta Lee, but it certainly did not have that effect. Byron would go on to flaunt his attachment to Augusta, and between that, the stories told to Annabella by Byron's former lover, Lady Caroline Lamb, and the general ill treatment that she received at his hands, this marriage did not last very long. So when the scandal of Byron's attachment to Augusta, among other unsavory doings of his, became public, Byron was essentially shunned by society. And this rejection, coupled with the heavy debts that he'd rung up, led to his self-exile from England in 1816, and he never returned. So it's at this point that Canto 3 of Childe Harold begins, and these are the stanzas I asked you to look at. The opening image is of Byron on the boat that is taking him away from England. Cantos 3 and 4, which are published much later than 1 and 2, are often considered to be much better as both as poetry, and because at this point Harold corresponds to the mature Byron, who really does have sorrows to be all Byronic about. The world weariness that kind of seemed like a pose in Cantos 1 and 2 are much more justified at this point. It's also worth noting that Childe Harold is subtitled a romaunt and is written in Spenserian stanzas of AB, AB, BC, BC, C. Both of which are rather archaic, harking back to medieval romance. So there's a sense in which the figure of Childe Harold is an attempt at escape into older times in which the hierarchy of nobility is more dominant. The first stanza of Canto 3 is highly personal. He mentions his daughter Ada, whom he would never see again, is leaving behind in England, and he casts himself as a Byronic hero for whom nothing in the world really matters anymore. The hours gone by when Albion's lessening shores could grieve or glad mine eye. So he claims indifference to his homeland, avows that he has instead become a wanderer, signified by the famous lines that begin stanza 2, once more upon the waters, once more. This defiant and personal opening might give the illusion that the poem is going to be about Byron himself. It's as though he has dropped the Harold persona from the first two cantos and is ready to just admit that it's him. But stanza 3 begins a rather strange process of doubling. In my youth's summer I did sing of one, the wandering outlaw of his own dark mind. So after casting himself as something of a wandering outlaw, he then reminds the reader that this is also the character who is the subject of his poem. He again seizes the theme, but with reservations that it has left, quote, a sterile track behind, as though he doubts its value. His reservations are amplified in the next stanza, where he admits that he has grown older and that, quote, it may be in vain that he returns to this poem. And yet he determines to continue because it might, quote, wean me from the weary dream of selfish grief or gladness, so it fling forgetfulness around me. It shall seem to me, though to none else, a not ungrateful theme. This bears some exploration. Byron casts himself as a figure in his own poem, only to draw back in order to return attention to his alter ego, who is very clearly precisely that, another version of himself. And then to claim that the purpose of this return is to help him to forget himself. So Harold becomes a fictionalized double of Byron, whose projected task is to liberate Byron from himself through the means of memory. The lines "wean me from the weary dream" suggest that it is his life that is fictional rather than the figure of Harold. And the fact that this is a dream of selfish grief or gladness might put us almost in mind of Shelley's definition of poetry in The Defense, a going out of the self through love and therefore an ability to experience the otherness of the world. In this case, of course, Byron imagines going out of himself not through love, but through suffering and melancholy. Moreover, the going out of himself is not valued for the other world that it might give access to, but precisely for its canceling out of this world. So it fling forgetfulness around me. It doesn't matter what it is. It's as though any diversion will do at this point. But the fact that this diversion is, in fact, a thinly veiled version of Byron, however, remains problematic. How can Harold really provide forgetfulness when he simply echoes Byron's sufferings and his movements throughout Europe? Moreover, how can one try to forget? The very effort of trying to forget implies memory. I'm put in mind of a Snoopy cartoon where Snoopy has had an unfortunate love affair and is drinking root beer to try to forget the beagle that he's been in love with, and after drinking root beer after root beer, you see him running down the street saying, "I've done it! I've forgotten what's her name." Which is, of course, funny because he's obviously hasn't forgotten her if he can say that. So the poem seems to raise this as a question, since in places Byron appears to quite successfully forget about his own woes, while at other times the scenes that he has Harold contemplate only lead back to an awareness of his own suffering. The ambiguity of the relation between poet and character continues into stanza 5, which begins with the pronoun he. Who is this he? Is it Harold, the antecedent from stanza 3? Is it Byron himself? Or is it simply a generic he referring to anyone who might be like Byron and Harold? This he is one who is grown old in deeds, not years, suggesting that we are aged not by time, but by our actions within time, our experience of it. Such a he, Byron tells us, knows why thought seeks refuge in lone caves yet rife with airy images. The answer follows in stanza 6. 'Tis to create and in creating live a being more intense. So creativity offers not just forgetfulness, but the potential for revitalization. So is it the intensity of Harold that sets him apart from Byron? The act of creativity gives Harold a heightened state of reality that Byron, in his listlessness, seems to lack. What am I? Nothing, but not so art thou, soul of my thought. This line suggests that Harold takes on a reality that Byron feels that he lacks, that the imaginative has a more enduring existence than the empirical self. And he questions the conclusions it leads him to. Stanza 7 begins, "Yet must I think less wildly. I have thought too long and darkly. And as a result, my springs of life were poisoned, but 'tis too late." Here, Byron self-consciously analyzes his Byronic makeup. He recognizes that he has brooded too much, that he did not learn self-restraint in youth, and hence fell into his Byronic excesses. Byron starts the following stanza by saying probably what we're all thinking at this point. Something too much of this. Let's get on with the story. Long absent Harold reappears at last. This moment marks the shift from Byron's tale of personal woe to the reincorporation of his projected figure of angst and woe. Interestingly, Byron heralds return in stanza 8 because he has been long absent, even though he, in a sense, appeared in stanza 3 and following, albeit in an absent way, not named and only present as an object of the creative mind of the narrator. After making clear how much he is himself like Harold, he takes refuge in what has now become a fairly obvious fiction. We see the extent to which Harold becomes a sort of defense mechanism for Byron, a protective armor that offers him protection against his own thoughts, but only in the ambiguous sense that can get from seeking protection against his own thoughts by writing about someone who is seeking protection from his own thoughts. Thus, while the mask seems to slip a little bit at the beginning of Canto 3, Byron then tries to put it back on, reestablishing the division between poet and character. Interestingly, by the time he writes Canto 4, he lets this persona slip altogether and speaks directly in first person. He describes being tired of creating a persona that nobody accepted as such anyway. Everybody just assumed that Harold was him anyway, so why bother faking it? But then, why create this persona in the first place? What do you suppose is the literary payoff for Byron in constructing this figure of Harold, only to show himself quite clearly to be lying behind it? Why create a mask to hide behind and then not hide behind it? In any case, Harold's status as Byronic hero should be clear from just a quick glance through the following stanzas. In stanza 9, still round him clung invisibly a chain which galled forever, fettering though unseen, and heavy though it clanked not, worn with pain. The feeling of being tormented and bound to a life that he does not enjoy. Or stanza 12, but soon he knew himself the most unfit of men to herd with man. Again, typical of the Byronic hero, the verb herd is a nice touch in reducing humanity to a bunch of animals. Then the end of stanza 12, proud though in desolation, which could find a life within to breathe without mankind. Again, the Harold described in these terms of unhappy, but still with that pride within himself. Stanza 14, this clay will sink its spark immortal. The clay spark metaphor is a favorite of Byron's. Clay signifies the dull part of humanity, but the Byronic hero claims to have a spark that raises him above the masses, albeit in a way that he necessarily suffers for. In stanza 15, but in man's dwellings he became a thing restless and worn, and stern and wearisome, dropped as a wild-born falcon with clipped wing, to whom the boundless air alone were home. another favorite metaphor for the Byronic hero, associated with birds of prey, but not quite able to be them. Harold's wings are clipped. And finally, stanza 16, with naught of hope left, but with less of gloom, the very knowledge that he lived in vain, that all was over on this side of the tomb, had made despair a smilingness assume. Harold is past the point of no return. Life can no longer be meaningful for him, but this in itself produces a feeling of contentment. Only after these introductory 16 stanzas does anything actually happen. The first stop on Harold's European tour is the battlefield of Waterloo, where he which had already become something of a tourist attraction, both because of the significance of the battle that took place there and the carnage that had been wrought. So interestingly, Harold's observation of the wreck of European civilization serves in the capacity that Byron hoped of offering forgetfulness. Individual woe is swept away in the sufferings of an entire people.